Hello and welcome back to Lecture 6 on our lecture series about the Vietnam War. We left off in our last lecture talking about kind of the change in American opinion about the war in Vietnam, right? The Tet Offensive, the generals had been saying that we were winning this war, but because the North Vietnamese are able to attack 13 cities in South Vietnam. It makes the American people think like they've been lied to, that we're not actually winning the war. And then with the My Lai massacre, it starts to make Americans think that maybe we're not the good guys in this war, even though that's kind of the exception to what the average American soldier was like in Vietnam. And not the rule because of the protests on the college campus. There's really this meme that's pushed that the American soldiers are these like bad guys that are massacring villages, which, to be fair, it did happen a few times, but that wasn't the average American soldier. But either way, LBJ quits. The world looks like it's in chaos. Maybe we're losing this war. And then, what we see is a series of events that's really going to make the average American feel like the world's just falling apart. And that's going to start with the assassination of Martin Luther King. So King is going to be, it's 68, right? He's worked his whole life to get the 64 Civil Rights Act passed. That's going to end discrimination all across America. It's going to, and then the 65 Voting Rights Act, that's going to make sure that Black people all across America are able to vote without any kind of restrictions. And there was this belief that if you can get those two laws passed, that everything is going to get better, and it doesn't. And so you start to see some radicalization, right? The growth in like more radical elements of the civil rights movement. With Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam. Huey Long and Huey Newton with the Black Panthers, and Martin Luther King really wants to kind of reassert himself in the movement. And, he's looking at the Vietnam War. He thinks that African Americans are disproportionately serving in the Vietnam War, and he's going to come out against the war. And when that happens, that's going to cause, African Americans to really kind of reassess the Vietnam War. There's going to start to be, movements of African Americans in essentially every major city across the United States with anti-war protests. There's going to be some riots, and it really puts King in the middle of just a massive countrywide controversy. And this really alienates the FBI. The FBI is aware that there are some death threats on Martin Luther King. They're tapping his phones, and they don't really tell him any specifics about people that wanted to kill him, which is going to cause some conspiracy theories later. But I mean, Martin Luther King knows his life's at risk. And so, but he's still this public figure. He's always put himself out there. He's this nonviolent civil disobedience guy. He always knew that, his life was at risk. And he's going to be in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel, where he will be shot by James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray shoots Martin Luther King, kills him. It's going to cause rioting all across the country. I mean, like the protests and kind of set the world on fire here when we kind of thought that the civil rights movement was dying down. And so James Earl Ray gets captured. He will confess, but then, he will recant his confession later. And so there's the trial is kind of people will question it because there's no testimony, and he recanted his confession, which means he took back his confession, which is going to again lead to multiple conspiracy theories here that James Earl Ray didn't do it. There's people out there saying the FBI did. No evidence for that. That's just conspiracy theory stuff. It's pretty easily discredited. Later we will, we do have James Earl Ray's fingerprints on the murder weapon but kind of mysterious circumstances there. So, the assassination of Martin Luther King is gonna, really kind of, cause chaos all across the country. And so the country's really looking for a figure now. We don't have a leader, right? LBJ is stepping down at the end of the election, and we're looking for a leader that's gonna be a unifier, right? There's all these campus protests, against the war. There's, working class Americans that are looking at those, elite college kids, like thinking it's your protests that are keeping my boy, who's actually fighting in the war, from getting the resources that he needs to win the war. So there's class tensions there, where in a really weird way, kind of the elite classes are anti-war, and then working classes, not as much. And there's this growing anti-war sentiment amongst both those groups because of Tet and because of My Lai. And so, there's just chaos everywhere. And pretty much everybody agrees that the one guy that can bring us together as a nation, the rich and the poor, whites and blacks, Republicans and Democrats, that one guy is believed to be Robert Kennedy. Everybody kind of, he's got the Kennedy mystique. He is a Democrat, but, the Kennedys are Democrats, but they have a lot of conservative aspects, right? They're cold warriors. They're, strong national defense. They are, they cut taxes. And so they appeal to Republicans. They appeal to both whites and blacks. Remember, Robert Kennedy was even more for the civil rights movement than JFK was. They intervened with the Freedom Riders, and so they appeal to both the white community and the black community. And so you've got this one guy that is, he's the shoe-in for the Democratic nomination, right? And he's kind of, everybody is looking to him to be the guy that unites America. And as he's campaigning in 1968, he'll be at the Ambassador Hotel in LA just after the Democratic convention, right? And so it looks like he's going to be the Democratic nominee. That shouldn't surprise anybody. And it really looks like he's probably going to be the next president and is going to be the guy that's going to be able to unite America and kind of end the chaos. And it's while he's at the Ambassador Hotel where he gets assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan Sirhan is a Palestinian who believes that the Kennedy administration has favored Israel in the Middle East over the Palestinians, and it really believes that the Kennedys have been anti-Palestinian, and so he assassinates Kennedy. And when he assassinates Kennedy, I mean, again, it just put yourself in the position of an average American. You're like, oh, like, this is crazy, right? We're potentially losing this war. There's, Martin Luther King is killed. There's these riots, race riots across the country. There's campus protests. There's all this just terrible stuff going on, and the world feels like it's chaotic. And this guy that was going to be our hero, our hope, and then boom, he's assassinated too. I mean, it looks like the world is falling apart, that there's no order, right? That there's no security. And that's just the feeling of America, right? No martyr's cause has ever been stilled by assassination bullet. Robert Kennedy's quote. I mean, it's this, it's just this awful time in the United States. And now the Democratic Party is really in a bind, right? This is the guy that was going to be the nominee, and they've got to come up. There's an election coming up, and the election doesn't stop because Robert Kennedy died. They've got to try and find somebody. After pretty much everybody has voted, they got to find a candidate now. And so they're going to meet in Chicago for a convention to pick their nominee after their golden boy has just been assassinated. And the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, is a part of one of the last surviving political machines in America, and which still exists today, as a matter of fact. Mayor Daley is, looking around and he's like, we're going to have the convention here. We're going to figure this out. Oh, we're going to lock the city down to make sure that things are, are orderly and happen. But what happens is because of the just the controversy within the Democratic Party, and a significant portion of it being anti-war, another portion of it that's just a moderate and is like, we can't just pull out of the war. We got to have a plan. We got to proceed logically. The college protesters in particular don't want to hear that. They just want out. And so a bunch of these anti-war protesters and college students are going to show up in Chicago to protest. Well, Daley doesn't want that to happen. He doesn't want the Democrats to look bad, and so he's going to send the police out in force and to clear the streets of any protesters. But those protesters arrive anyway, and what ends up happening is the media is there to take a look at it and to watch the convention. And they're filming it, and as they're filming it, what essentially America sees is the Democratic Party in absolute chaos. Right out in the streets, Daley's police force are beating the protesters, and if you're an average American, you're looking and like that. Your kid's probably a college student, or if he's not off fighting the war, and you're looking, watching the police just beat up on these protesters live on TV. I mean, you don't like that. It looks like chaos on the streets. And then on the floor of the convention, you're going to see chaos on the floor of the convention. Nobody knows who they want to pick for to run for president. And so there's chaos there. Now eventually they'll settle on Hubert Humphrey, but it's so chaotic on the floor of the convention, which is also being, there's reporters that are reporting on what's happening in there. There's just chaos, and fistfights actually break out within the convention. And so there's fighting, like you see in the photo here. There's fighting outside in Chicago, where cops are just beating up these protesters, and the protesters are not innocent in this, right? But it's still the cops, the authority, and people that are meant to serve and protect are beating up people that are protesting, which is a right that we have, even though you have to do it in a certain process, right? And they're out there, they're beating, and all of a sudden, the people on the floor of the convention are like, the world is watching. We got to get our stuff together. Like, this is absolutely crazy. And the American people that are watching this just see the Democratic Party and they feel like they've lost faith in it. Johnson, who's a Democrat, Kennedy, who's a Democrat, is the guy that initially got us into Vietnam. Johnson, who's a Democrat, has escalated Vietnam. Essentially, the people believe he lied about it. I think that's questionable. I mean, and it was Johnson, a Democrat, who presided over the war and the Tet Offensive and the My Lai massacre. Although you can't just pin that on him, but the American people will. And then the chaos of the Democratic Party at the convention, and it looks like Democrats don't have their stuff together. And so that leads us to the election of 68, where we're essentially, the American people are fed up with the Democratic Party, and they're going to turn to anybody that they believe that can just return to a sense of law and order and normalcy. No more riots, no more campus protests, right? Let's get out of Vietnam. Let's issue just law and order and stability. And that's what they want. They want stability from all this chaos. And so in the context of that, is the election of 68 and Hubert Humphrey versus Richard Nixon. Nixon will run as the law and order candidate. He's just going to come back. Remember, he lost to Kennedy. He got in trouble during the Eisenhower administration with, that he gets out of with the Checker speech. And so everybody kind of thinks his career is over. But because he's able to come out strong as a law and order candidate and speak for what he terms as forgotten America, the silent majority, right? That average guy that lives in Ohio or Wisconsin that just wants to go to work and doesn't want to have to deal with, campus protests and race riots and war, that just wants to, have a sense of security in America domestically. Right, that guy is really going to, like Richard Nixon, who's saying, I'm going to shut down these campus protests, and these campus that they're not the majority, they're the loud minority, and so I'm going to shut them down. I'm going to, make sure that we have a plan to get out of Vietnam. He actually says he has a secret plan. I think, by the way, anytime a politician tells you they have a secret plan, I would question that, because why is it secret? This is democracy. Cut that out. Just like McCarthy with his secret list of spies, like nobody, no secrets, right? But anyway, Nixon says he's got a secret plan to end the fighting in Vietnam. It's really nothing much other than kind of what Johnson had already started to do, which is to pass the fighting over to the South Vietnamese. There's some exceptions. He's going to threaten massive bombing retaliation, and potentially even nuclear war on the North if they get a little crazy. But essentially, it's the same plan as what Johnson has, and just runs as this law and order guy, and that's going to be enough to get him elected. The Democrats also help him, because remember, it was the Democratic Party that opposed, even though you've got Kennedy and Johnson, who are Democratic presidents that supported civil rights. The Democratic Party in general was split on it. Half of them were adamantly opposed to civil rights. And so George Wallace, who is against integrating schools and does not like the civil rights movement at all, he's going to hurt Hubert Humphrey's chance of winning by running for president too. So the Democratic Party is split essentially over whether or not, over the civil rights movement. And so that will directly lead to Richard Nixon becoming president. And you can see here, here's a map here. Nixon will win all these red states, and we've got Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, in green, and Wallace, the Democrat, run as American, but he's a Democrat, in brown. And so Nixon is going to walk away with 43.2% of the popular vote, but 56.1% of the Electoral College. And so it's actually really close. The election is really close in the popular vote. If Hubert Humphrey wouldn't have run, what you would have seen is Hubert Humphrey would have won the popular vote, still would have lost the Electoral College vote. But we have a closely divided country here. And so, law and order ends up taking the day. Now, this is Richard Nixon, or as he will be called later, Tricky Dick. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the Whitewater scandal. So my computer froze up. Hopefully everybody is good here. And I said Whitewater, the Watergate scandal. Sorry, I get the Whitewater and with the Clintons and Watergate confused sometimes. So the Watergate scandal. All right. So what is Nixon's secret plan? Well, his secret plan is going to be called Operation Duck Hook. It's really the plan is pretty simple. It's a series of escalating threats against the North, saying, back off, we're still supporting the South, as we start to pull our troops out. And that is meant to give the South Vietnamese time to be able to properly train. And so computer's falling apart. So the idea is to give the South Vietnamese enough time to properly train to be able to take over the war. We're trying to leave the war, and this is important to understand. We're trying to pull out without the South Vietnamese falling to communists. So the war's not going to end, right? The South and the North are still going to be fighting. we're just not going to be involved with it. And we're going to part of the plan is to provide the materials to the South that the South needs to win the war. So that idea is essentially just called Vietnamization, right? We're going to take the war out of America being the driving force and make the Vietnamese fight their own war. And so that's essentially it. We'll pull our troops out while we start to hand the war over to the South Vietnamese army. Now, the reality is the South Vietnamese army is not going to be prepared to do this. They have been allowing the Americans to be the primary fighting force here. They're tired of fighting. I don't think that they even, the average South Vietnamese person really even cares that much. And that's not entirely true. But we've got a divided South Vietnam. So the people in the cities, they are pretty close to America. Their economy is pretty close to America. They've benefited from the military bases. They tend to be pretty pro-American and have helped us. The rural South Vietnamese, the people out in the countryside, they tend to support the North. And so divided South Vietnam fighting a united North Vietnam, that's just not going to end well for the South Vietnamese. But Nixon is like, I don't care. I want out of this. He wants to focus on, we'll talk about this in a later lecture, realpolitik. And the idea is real politics, like we should focus on the things that really matter in international politics. And so he wants to focus on China, which is a major world power, and not focus so much on, Vietnam, which doesn't really serve a strategic interest to America. We're moving away from containment and domino theory. And we're just like that. We're not going to worry about those small places, worry about the big places. So Vietnamization helps Nixon with that. And so, but to be able to do this, he still doesn't want South Vietnam to fall to the North Vietnamese. And so to be able to put the South Vietnamese in a position to win, he's going to really start to escalate the war before he de-escalates it, right? I mean, he wants to pulverize the North before America pulls out to make them as soft as possible so the South can win. Now, the only really way to do that is to stop the supplies that are coming into the South. And so, for most of this war, the supplies are being brought down through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so the North Vietnamese, they don't really care. They just want to win the war. They don't care so much about other countries' sovereignty, right? And so when you look at Vietnam, their neighbors, Laos and Cambodia, when you see with the map here, maybe I should pull, there you go. When you see in the map here, the neighboring countries, America respects the sovereignty of those countries. We don't want to expand the war into those countries that are staying out of the war. The North doesn't really care about that. And so we're not going to send our troops into Laos and Cambodia under, Kennedy and Johnson. The policy is not going to be to do that, although there were times during the war. But for the most part, we're not going to do that. Well, the North knows that. And so to supply troops and materials to the fighters in South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese know if they want to transport those troops safely, they should transport them through the jungle in Laos and Cambodia through what is referred to as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so they're able to essentially bring supplies down without having to worry about us attacking them because it's in a foreign country. They're able to attack in the South and then run into Cambodia and hide in Cambodia where American troops won't follow them to kill them. And so the North is using that to their advantage. Everybody in America knows that. And, it's a real serious handicap to us. And so Nixon, to soften up the North, decides if North Vietnam takes the war into Laos and Cambodia, we're going to follow them into Laos and Cambodia, which is, as far as a military strategy, probably very smart. But as far as, international politics goes, this is going to upset many Americans that were expanding the war into countries that don't want to have anything to do with it. And it's going to upset the international community because America's military is so strong. If they feel like that they can spread war into any country they want to, that puts everybody at risk. And so the international community is going to be very concerned about this. So Nixon is going to secretly start bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the VC camps that are in Laos and Cambodia to try and soften them up for the South moving forward. So here's a picture of the Ho Chi Minh Trail here, and so you can see that trail. And bombing the trail, we've talked about this in previous lectures. It's not like a highway system. It is literally in the jungle. It is like a foot-worn path, muddy path, like you would take on a hike to get supplies into South Vietnam. So when we when we drop bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that doesn't really do much unless we happen to get lucky and hit a person, and it's hard to tell because of the canopy, right? But once we send troops into that area, that all of a sudden we're going to be able to destroy a whole bunch of VC camps and take a whole lot of their supplies. You combine the fact that the North Vietnamese really lost the Tet Offensive, even though the American citizens think that the North won the Tet Offensive. Well, they actually lost it. The North is on their heels. They're in trouble. And so they've lost a ton of material. They've lost a ton of soldiers, and they need to get supplies and people down in the South. And once Nixon expands into Laos and Cambodia, which is internationally illegal, not a great thing to do politically, but it is going to put even more pressure on the North. And so the North is reeling because of this. And so militarily, this is actually working out pretty well for America and South Vietnam. But as soon as the world finds out about this, they're going to be outraged. Combine the fact that people are outraged that we've expanded into Laos and Cambodia with Nixon's order to increase the bombing in Vietnam, which is referred to as the Christmas bombing. So by December of 1972, right, we really unleash this massive bombing campaign around Hanoi and Haiphong, and when we do that, the American people who want this war to be over, they're upset at the expansion of the war again, right? And so all of a sudden now, international communities, like you said, you were getting out, we're upset, and then all of a sudden, people find out about the expansion into Laos and Cambodia. As people find out about the expansion into Laos and Cambodia, the college campuses blow up in protest, right? So, and Kent State is, going to be kind of one of the tragedies that's going to happen because of those protests. Remember, Nixon is all about silencing these protests. He actually has people spying on these leaders. So there's some shady things there that if you like democracy, the Nixon administration does some shady stuff that's pretty anti-democratic. But either way, at Kent State, once it's known that the war has been escalated, the protesters there light the ROTC building on fire. And so the ROTC, the college kids that are training to go into the military after graduation, the protesters, the anti-war protesters, light that building on fire. When that building is lit on fire, the National Guard gets called out to stop these protesters from any more violent action. Well, once the National Guard is there, the protesters then actually in force go to protest the National Guard being there. And when it's there, these National Guard troops, they're scared. The ROTC was just attacked, and I'm not justifying anything that's happening here. I'm just trying to give you the full context of what happened. And they get freaked. We don't necessarily know exactly what happened here, but the National Guard gets scared at the protest and opens fire. And when they open fire, some of these protesters are going to be killed on the Kent State campus in Ohio. Neil Young writes a song about it. It's called Ohio, 4 Dead in Ohio. And it really I mean, the idea is that, I mean, this just outrages the American public. It's like we're not safe on our, in our own campuses, in our own country, and they're all of a sudden now they're killing our children at home. Is what a lot of these anti-war people are going to be saying. And images, again, another iconic image coming from the Vietnam War is this one right here. The camera's backwards. It's so weird. But anyway, it's this image right here, and of somebody being shot on campus. And so again, it's just this more of this chaos, and it's going to push more and more Americans away from supporting the Vietnam War. There's a clip on the PowerPoint that's on the website to the song Ohio by Neil Young, which is about this event. Now, we're also going to see another lesser known campus shooting as well in Jackson State. Jackson State is primarily African-American campus. There's protests happening on the campus in Mississippi. And the police open fire, and we're going to see protesters being killed here as well. This is really going to inflame the African American population of in America, in large part because this happens on, there are African Americans that are going to be killed here. And, the entire country is going to be outraged about what happened at Kent State, but is essentially going to ignore what happens on Jackson State and at Jackson State. And so, now, I don't know if there's probably a racial element to that. It is the 70s we're talking about. I don't know if it's because Kent State happened first, or if it's because just, it was a bigger event with the way that the National Guard was confronted and all of that. But the reporting ends up being about Kent State. And the African-American population gets really upset when, the country freaks out because they're like, well, it was white kids that died at Kent State, and there were African-Americans killed at Jackson State, and those African-American deaths weren't really reported on. And so there's going to be, some more disillusionment with African-Americans in the war because of that. So that leads us to this sense of getting out of the war as quickly as possible. And Nixon promised that. And so we're going to see an escalation of the efforts to get us out of the war. And Nixon is going to send his right-hand man, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is one of the most famous diplomats in American history. Some people love him, some people hate him. He's kind of the architect of realpolitik. Like, let's not waste our time on these small countries that don't really matter to us. Let's focus on China. He really wants to get out of the Vietnam War. And so he goes to Paris to start to negotiate American withdrawal from the war, and eventually is going to be successful. And by 73, Nixon is going to convince Saigon, right, the capital of the South. Well, later, after this war is over and the South falls to the North, will be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. I mean, Ho Chi Minh's like, hey, rename your capital after myself. But anyway, Kissinger and Nixon convinced Saigon that if that America's going to leave, that we will still protect them with materials, so that they're going to be in a good spot from the North. And on January 23rd, the final drafts get signed, and America is going to leave the war. That doesn't mean the war is over. The South is still fighting the North. It's just not going to be with the help of the United States. And so essentially, we're done, right? All of this case, Nixon did what he said he was going to do. He pulls out, and we're essentially leaving the South on their own. And when we leave the South on their own, they are not prepared for this, right? Even though the North has been weakened because of the bombing, the expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos, which we back off of eventually because of the political pressure there. And even though they've been weakened because of Tet and so on and so forth, because we back out, that gives the North time to kind of resupply, re-equip, and they are going to be continuing the fight. So the war ends. America's coming home, and we're leaving the South on their own. And as we do that, as we leave the South on their own, the North eventually just marches down into the South. This is devastating for the cities in South Vietnam. When the North is marching down, slowly marching down to Saigon, the capital, the people that are living in the cities, if they're not evacuated, they're being sent to re-education camps. They're being murdered outright. Anybody who fought for the South Vietnamese army, they and their family are at risk of being killed or sent to re-education camps, concentration camps. Anybody who worked for the American government or tended to be sympathetic at all, risked being killed. And so there's no plan to evacuate. We have, essentially a governor, an American governor running like the at least the American side of things in South Vietnam. This guy doesn't prepare for an evacuation. He really doesn't think, as the North has invaded the South, right, that they're violating the terms of the peace agreement. He really believes that the America is going to step back in and protect the South. And so, the cities are essentially being left on their own as the northern troops start to advance into the South. Eventually, Saigon gets surrounded, and we're in a point where now, the American troops are being evacuated, right? They're getting out and without much of a problem. But the South Vietnamese that helped us, anybody that was a part of the government or the South Vietnamese military, or even civilians that were just friendly to us, they're at risk of being killed here. Remember, this is a communist North Vietnamese government. They're not sympathetic to non-communists. And so, the people start to flood to the American embassy in Saigon, begging to be, to help get out of South Vietnam, because they and their families are at risk of being killed. And the Americans aren't helping. And so the ambassador to, I said governor earlier, but the ambassador to South Vietnam, actually, even though he's the guy at fault for not having a plan to evacuate all the people who helped us, he actually decides to stay on in the embassy as the American military is evacuating the American troops. And then once the troops are out, he orders that we start to help evacuate all the people who helped us in Vietnam. So, which is, at this point, whatever we do, it's not going to be enough, but we've got to try and help at least as much as we can. And so the war's over at this point. The South has won. Vietnam is all communist now. And so, did America win or lose the Vietnam War? Some people say, oh, it was a draw. They never really defeated us militarily. We just quit. Well, the goal was to keep Vietnam from falling, South Vietnam from falling to communism. Well, we didn't accomplish that goal. So I would make the argument that, yes, we lost. We lost a war without really having lost any battles. And so, wrap your head around that. So anyway, we're at the point now where it is trying to get out all of the people who helped us to protect them. And this is going to be called Operation Frequent Wind. And it's really ad hoc. We're kind of making up as we go. And so the ambassadors decided to stay to the last minute. There's helicopters coming into the embassy. We get out all of the actual Americans out of the city, but then the people of Saigon are swamping the city, hoping that the Americans will help get them out. And the ambassador says, start shipping. He stays, right, risking his life, while the helicopters are loaded up with civilians, South Vietnamese civilians, and taken out to the aircraft carriers and battleships that are out in the ocean. to make room on these battleships, because there's not enough room on the aircraft carriers, the American soldiers start like dumping these, $1 million airplanes, $100 million airplanes, whatever the cost is, dumping them into the ocean so we can have enough room to fit as many people on these aircraft carriers as possible. That's not going to be enough. A lot of these soldiers on their own are going to like go out and they're going to like steal private ships in the harbors around Saigon and use those to try and get out as many people as possible. Remember, like, a lot of these soldiers have married people from South Vietnam and they want to be able to take their families with them. And so they're stealing like cargo ships and then just trying to get as many people out as possible. And, very heroically, the ambassador stays until essentially he can't stay anymore. The president like orders him to leave. He still resists leaving, but as the communists start to get closer and closer to the embassy, he knows he's got to go, and so eventually he gets on, and then Operation Frequent Wind stops. We can't have an American ambassador captured here, so as soon as he's the last one off, everyone else, and we're going to leave, thousands and hundreds of thousands, and really across the whole country, millions of people potentially, we're going to leave behind. These people that they're wearing Western clothes or they're wearing Army uniforms, they're immediately in the middle of the street going to rip off their Army uniform and literally walk home naked, because the communists that see anybody in a military uniform just going to summarily execute them. Right. And so they're going to burn the embassy down. They want to burn all the paperwork and destroy all that, because the communists are going to look through that and they're going to look for anybody's names. Maybe you were just working as a secretary at the embassy, or working as a janitor on one of the military bases, and your name might be on a piece of paper. The communists don't care. They're just going to kill you. Right. And so they light all that stuff on fire and destroy as much as possible. And we essentially abandon these people to kind of take care of themselves. And, a lot of them are going to end up in re-education camps, which are concentration camps. A lot of them are going to be killed. And Vietnam is going to fall to the communists. Now, that being said, Ho Chi Minh will not be, even though he's communist, he will not be a puppet of either China or Russia. He is his own kind of independent guy, just like Tito was in Yugoslavia. Most communist countries are puppets of either China or of Russia. Vietnam, not so much. They will have some independence. They're going to do horribly oppressive things, just like all of these extremely socialist and communist countries do. They're going to eliminate all kinds of freedom, private ownership. The economic situation in Vietnam is going to be terrible for years. It will eventually get better as they start to loosen up those communist policies, as they become less communist. So there's bad stuff happening in Vietnam, but there's good stuff too. Ho Chi Minh later, there's the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which is also a communist country, is going to be committing a genocide. It's going to be the Vietnamese that step in and stop that. So it's not all terrible. But it is a loss of American prestige, and is a turning point in American thought about their government. Americans up until Vietnam have really trusted their government. And because of Vietnam and then later Watergate, not Whitewater, Watergate. Later, because of those things, Americans are really going to stop trusting politicians. And like, you ask the average American today, do you trust your government? Do you trust politicians? The answer is no. Well, that's relatively new in American political discourse. And it's because of Vietnam and the way Vietnam went down, coupled with what's going to happen with the Nixon administration. All right, so that is going to leave us. That's going to leave us. This is where we're going to leave off in this lecture. There'll be one more lecture in our Vietnam series, and it's going to just be a very short one over, why did America lose the war? So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you tolerating how much I've bumbled through this lecture today. I'm definitely not on my A game. Thank you very much. Have a good day, and I will see you soon.